Hey, this is Elwin Robinson, and you are listening to the Rejuvenate Podcast. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the importance of the pineal gland, both for quality of life and health, but also longevity, and the specific bioregulator peptides, Epitalon, Pinealon, as well as some of the other versions of that, like Epitalamin and Pineamin. And we'll talk about why they are something that you may want to consider when it comes to longevity. Of course, we're going to be covering what is a bioregulator peptide, what is the pineal gland, what's the importance of each, how does one benefit the other. We'll look at where the research comes from. In this case, it's primarily from one specific Russian group. I'll tell the story about how they were first discovered in a Soviet military lab in the 1970s, of all places. What makes bioregulator peptides unusual in terms of their mechanism, because they are quite distinct and they are different from the other peptides that you're probably more likely to have heard of that are more popular, like BPC-157 and CB500 and all that kind of thing that you probably have come across already, how they work at a gene expression level, what evidence actually shows, both in animal and human, and how convincing that evidence actually is, the difference between natural glandular extracts versus synthetic peptides, because, spoiler alert, these peptides were originally found by working with animal glandulars, which we'll talk about, why the pineal gland is more important to long-term health than mainstream medicine usually tends to acknowledge, what happens to it as you age, including calcification and the collapse of melatonin production. We'll also talk about the input of fluoride and various other things that can debilitate the function of the pineal gland even earlier. So even earlier because it seems to inevitably degrade as you get older. We'll talk about how Epitalon works to restore pineal function and why it's certainly not the same as just taking melatonin, how Pinealon works, why it can cross the blood-brain barrier even orally. In fact, that is a thing about these bioregulator peptides as well, that they are successful and actually work orally, whereas most of the, again, common ones that people are talking about, whether it's GLP-1s or BPCs or whatever, generally, well, I guess BPC is an exception, but TB500, all the rest of them generally need to be injected to be effective. What the research suggests is actually achievable with each peptide, the dosing forms and what a realistic protocol looks like across optimal, best value, and most convenient options, because each of those are a little bit different, who these are suited for, who should avoid them, and then we'll address some of the concerns about it, like telomeres and even the C word, and we'll look at some of the other things that you can do to optimize the pineal gland, but we'll do that kind of briefly because we have a lot to cover, and if you want a non-peptide based pineal health episode, then let me know and we can always do that separately, but I'll touch on a few things as well. All that and more coming up in today's episode. And remember, if you're a fan of the podcast, like, subscribe. If you're on YouTube, comment and share with anyone who you think might be open to this. I appreciate your help in helping this podcast grow. Have you ever done a specific health protocol or a supplement or a diet plan or an exercise regime that everyone seems to be raving about, like it really works, and then you tried it and for you it did nothing or it actually made you worse? Well, you weren't imagining it, and no, it's not because you did it wrong somehow. It's because we're all different, and in fact the difference may well be in your DNA. And that's the subject of my upcoming book, Generic Health Advice is Making You Sick. It's coming out on May the 7th, 2026. Yes, it may already be out by the time you listen to this. And if you go to rejuvenateblueprint.com, it'll give you a link to the book to get it at the cheapest possible price when it first launched. This is book one in a series of 7 different books, and every time they launch, the first few days, it's going to be available at 90% off. So even if you missed that first book, go to rejuvenateblueprint.com and sign up to find out, to get notified when the next book launches at 90% off. So let's start off by talking about bioregulator peptides, what they are, how they work, and how they were discovered, because how they were discovered is interesting when we look at how they work, as well as the different forms that are out there and what you might want to consider actually trying yourself. So bioregulator peptides, they're often called Khavinson peptides. And what they are is very short chains of amino acids, typically 2 to 7 amino acids long, but often 2, 3, or 4 amino acids long. That's the most common. So if you compare that to something like insulin, that's 51 amino acids long. Even oxytocin, 11 amino acids long. We're talking about something that is very small compared to most of the peptides that are commonly talked about. Certainly a lot smaller than GLP-1s as well, as another example. So what makes them different from other peptides is how they work. So most peptides stay outside cells, they bind to surface receptors, and then they trigger internal signals from the outside. So they still act upon the cell, but they do it externally. Bioregulators, because they're so small, because amino acids are tiny, one of the main things that your very DNA is composed of, they can actually cross that barrier of the cell membrane and the nuclear envelope, meaning they can get into the nucleus of the cell, the center of the cell, and interact directly with the DNA and the histones. So that's a fundamentally different thing. One, you got your cell, something's acting on it on the outside. The other one, it's getting right into the very core of it, okay? And so the idea is that each short peptide sequence is complementary to a specific promoter region of DNA. When it binds there, it helps the transcription factors and RNA polymerase to do their job, effectively switching on genes involved in cellular repair, differentiation, and maintenance. So this makes them what researchers often call epigenetic switches. So to do a brief digression on that, there's 2 types of genetics that you generally want to be focused on as maybe an average level of interest in health biohacker. There is here's what I'm born with that I can't change. So that's your SNPs. That's the kind of thing that we address in advanced health genetics. But then there's what can I optimize given the cards that I've been dealt by genetics, by my SNPs, in terms of my diet, my lifestyle, my mindset, all of that kind of stuff. And so that's called epigenetics. And so the interesting thing about bioregulators is that they have this epigenetic effect. I guess a lot of different substances do, but they have it in a very direct way by going right into the nucleus of the cell and helping the DNA to actually turn certain things on and turn certain things off, like a methylation process. So to put it in layman's terms, they're potentially actually reprogramming your genes in a way that helps make you younger. That's what's pretty exciting about them. So I think it's worth briefly going into the history of how they were discovered, because I think it partly helps explain why they are not more popular and universally focused on, despite being such a major breakthrough in health and well-being and longevity potentially. So they were discovered in the early 1970s in the Soviet Union. And of course, during that time, there was a complete lack of communication between scientists in the Soviet Union and most of what we, I guess, call the Western world. And relations have thawed to some degree since then, but not really that much. There's still a lot of antagonism. And so there's still a lot of not taking on board things that are discovered there, basically. That would be my theory of it. Anyway, it wasn't discovered, a lot of American longevity and health discoveries are kind of people focused more on wellness. This wasn't the case for peptides. That's the other interesting thing about them. Their discovery was actually a classified military project. So the head scientist called Vladimir Khavinson, and by the way, bioregulator peptides are still sometimes called Khavinson peptides, and you often see that name, Khavinson, when you are looking up peptides. Sometimes on the website it'll say genuine Khavinson peptides or whatever. So they were initially developed to protect soldiers, astronauts, and athletes from stressors like radiation and also laser-induced retinal damage. They still, Russia, I would say, have some of the most advanced, interesting technology when it comes to the vision healing and repair specifically. Now, I couldn't verify this, but I'm going to include it anyway. The story that I heard is that it was specifically around nuclear submarines. So the health and safety standards were not as robust in the Soviet Union in general as developing in the Western countries, and this got to all levels, including nuclear submarines. And so the nuclear submarine is quite a specific situation, even compared to a nuclear plant, because if you are a sailor, you are stuck in a submarine for extended periods of time with this nuclear material, which is probably improperly shielded. And so what they started to observe is that their soldiers, sailors, I'm not sure of the term, were coming back damaged and prematurely aging significantly. They would be gone for 6 weeks and it would look like they've aged, years, literally. And so this was obviously concerning. And so rather than taking the more classic, I guess, Western approach, which was let's put more safety measures in place, protocols, all the rest of it, I would say that it's very much in the Russian spirit to, let's make ourselves stronger and be able to endure more, as opposed to let's shield ourselves and make ourselves safer, which, I'm laughing, but it's who's to say which is a better approach? You could argue the Russian approach is better in many ways. But anyway, so rather than putting a bunch of safety procedures in place, although they may have done that, what they also focused on is how do we strengthen our soldiers so that they are more resilient and robust and less damaged by this stuff. And so when they looked at these, I'm going to use the word soldiers rather than sailors. When they looked at these soldiers, they saw that that the place where they seem to have aged most noticeably and considerably is the pineal gland and the thymus gland. And so they started to go, okay, making a leap. If the pineal gland and the thymus gland are the most obviously aged, and we can see that the person is generally most obviously aged, then the pineal gland and the thymus gland must be key. And so they started working on technology that would help. So that was the origin of it. That's anecdotal, but this is what I've heard. But eventually, astronauts was another thing. The space program was obviously a big thing. Athletes as well. So, it was the Olympics, it was the space program, and it was the Cold War, right? These are the three different places where Soviets are really trying to show off and prove their supremacy or dominance or whatever it might be. So then they tried a lot of different things, but one of the things they looked at is traditional folk medicine. And traditional folk medicine would say that if you have an organ or gland that is prematurely aging, that is suffering, that is struggling, then you eat that organ or gland. In fact, I remember quite a long time ago now, back in 2018, with the Liver King, way before he became the internet sensation that he briefly was, looking at their website, Ancestral Supplements, and looking at how they were selling those different products and seeing basically the kind of hook, the whole science behind, because otherwise why on earth would you want to dry up a cow's testicle and put it in a capsule and swallow it, or anything, right? Adrenal gland, pineal gland. Well, so the justification on the sales page, other than all the nutrients that are in it, which admittedly is there, was this idea of radioactive isotopes. So what they said is, when, I think this is specifically more of glands than organs, when they put radioactive isotopes in a glandular formula and then have someone swallow it, they will be able to see that a lot of them would go to the corresponding gland. So if they put a bunch of radioactive isotopes in thyroid glandulars, then they would see a lot of them would end up in the thyroid. If they put radioactive isotopes in the pancreas, they'd see a lot of them would end up in the pancreas, etc. And so what they took from that is that there is nutrition specifically in that organ or gland which benefits the organ or gland of the person consuming them. It's a bit of a leap, but it's not much of a one. It makes sense. Now, that's as far as they went in that particular selling situation. And I was always curious about that. And then, something like 3 or 4 years later, I learned why. And it's because of this. This is my understanding of it, is bioregulator peptides. So what is the thing, this mysterious thing, which is in organs and glands that if you consume the organs and glands, it helps to heal the organ and gland. Well, my understanding is that it is these bioregulator peptides. They are naturally in our organs and glands to some degree, and as they become more depleted, our health will go downhill, and we can, re-strengthen our cells, rejuvenate our cells by consuming them from an animal. That's the basic idea behind it. And so that's, in a nutshell, the discovery. And so there was a little bit, just give credit where credit's due. This is an interesting little factoid as well. The discovery of peptides themselves, a little bit before this glandular thing, was partly down to the work of Ivan Pavlov, which you may have heard of because of the whole idea of Pavlov's dogs, right? The idea that if you condition an animal, say if you associate punishment or reward, I think it was reward actually most famously, reward with a specific stimulus like the sound of a ringing bell, then every time that he rung a bell, once he'd conditioned them, then the dogs would start salivating because they kind of associate the ringing of the bell with the treat that they used to get at the same time. So that Pavlov was also involved in discovering peptides. So that's interesting as well. Now, to Khavinson's credit, even though he was initially a military man, he began as a colonel in the Soviet Ministry of Defense, is that he decided not to hoard this potentially life-transforming technology and only give it with, secret applications to Olympic athletes or astronauts or whatever, or to spies or the military. He decided to actually make it available to the general public, to push to make it available to the general public, which he eventually did, which is something that he deserves great credit for. So he then set up this research institute in St. Petersburg called the Institute of Bioregulation and Gerontology, which is still going, and it still remains the primary global center for this field of research to this day. So that's his legacy. It's still ongoing. It's not easy to get there maybe because of visa things these days for most non-Russians with Russia, but if you were to go there, you could still be treated with these peptide treatments. Now, over those 40 years of investigation, they discovered a lot of different peptides of various types that we're going to go into, which they showed in a lot of different experiments will slow aging and extend the human lifespan, as well as improve and optimize the function of all kinds of organs and glands, like we were talking about earlier. It's debatable how much it helps to heal your pancreas to just eat, a cow or a pig or whatever's pancreas. But they wanted to make it less debatable, and so they've done a bunch of research. If we extract those bioregulator, again, remember, very short chain, just a few amino acids, peptides from, let's say, a cow's pancreas, how much healing can occur to the pancreas specifically as a result of that, and what impact does that have, for instance, in the case of type 2 diabetes and insulin levels and all the rest of it. And it turned out that perhaps there was quite a considerable amount. So they ended up creating 6 peptide-based pharmaceuticals, 64 peptide food supplements. So these are, really more a matter of classification rather than really structurally any different. He also offered 196 patents and published over 775 scientific papers. He was, despite the kind of, not wanting to give people credit who are Russians, he was nominated for the Nobel Prize in 2010. And in 2011, the European Association of Gerontology, representing 40 countries, elected him as president of their organization. So it was such good work that eventually international recognition did happen. He finally passed away in 2024, but his body of work is considered probably the most sustained peptide research in scientific history. I decided to include this little, few minutes chunk of history in here because a lot of people are talking about peptides, not a lot of people are giving credit where credit is due. And so as we're specifically talking about bioregulators and the pineal, in this case, this really is purely Khavinson's and team's breakthrough. So I wanted to give credit where credit is due. So now we have to, if we want to put our skeptic cap on for a second, we do have to acknowledge that most of almost all, not all, but almost all the research that shows the sometimes very surprisingly impressive effects of these peptides comes from this source. So if you have a tendency to be very skeptical or dismissive of research coming from this country, then I just want to be honest with you that that is where most of it comes from. I actually decided to do this episode because I started noticing in at least my little corner of social media, a lot of people have started raving about the two peptides, Epitalon and Pinealon, specifically, and using an oral form of it and showing different aura ring and whoop and all the rest of it results about how much better they're sleeping and how much more deep sleep they're getting and how much better the recovery is and how it's like night and day and just how effective it is. And I've seen, a couple of pulses of that, and I'm sure it's going to carry on going because this is the thing. These things, while they are not necessarily as immediately obvious in their effect as, I don't know, let's say Ambien in the case of these peptides, because a lot of the time sleep and recovery is one of the things that we focus on in terms of immediate effects with pineal peptides. Although again, long term, the focus is really more on longevity, as we'll talk about. So I wanted to create this episode as like a complete guide to these peptides that people are talking about, so people can really find out more about them and hear all about the orange of them and the different types and all the rest of it. So speaking of which, let's go into explaining the different types of bioregulators in general. So the first type is, and I believe the first type to be discovered, is Cytomaxes. So these are absolutely still available. Some people swear that they are the best. They are the natural extracts from animal organ tissue. So they are the parent compound of, let's say, Epitalon, Epitalamin. You can get a Cytomax version of pineal peptides. It's sold these days under the name Pineamin, Pineamin. It's classified as a pharmaceutical in Russia and tends to be tricky to get outside of Russia unless you're buying from Russia or in a similarly Russia-affiliated country like, say, Kazakhstan. But it is available. It is very expensive. The reason being that, certainly by Russian standards anyway, I mean, not compared to some different medical and pharmaceutical treatments, but if you compare it to supplements, it's expensive. The reason is because the Cytomax are this very meticulous extraction from animal tissues. And generally, most of the other Cytomax is not that expensive. So, for instance, there's an equivalent called Thymelin, which is a extract from the thymus gland, and often these two are taken together. We'll touch on thymus peptides briefly in this episode, but not too much. Maybe that'll be a different episode. So the reason why the Pineamin is so expensive compared to the others is just because thymus glands, especially in animals, in cows, are pretty large still, but pineal glands are small in all animals. So you don't get a lot of pineal gland from even a lot of dead cows, and you don't get a lot of Pineamin from a pineal gland. So basically it takes a lot. It takes the actual extraction process is expensive, and bovine pineal gland is not abundant because they're still pretty small. So that's my understanding of why the price is significantly higher than other bioregulator peptides. But it is available, and it is considered to be so effective that it's classed as a pharmaceutical in Russia. There are obviously other Cytomaxes. There's really one for every kind of major organ, gland, and system in the body that is an extract. So it's things you might think of like liver and pancreas and thyroid and all the rest of it. And then there's ones for like specific areas as well, like muscles and vascular tissue and all the rest of it as well. So that's Cytomaxes. Then there's Cytogens. So these are synthetic short peptides. So what's the difference? In a Cytomax, the peptides are extracted from raw glandular, but they still have some other stuff as well. They might have some free-floating amino acids. They have various other compounds in there. So it's way more extracted than buying a glandular from somewhere like Ancestral Supplements, but it is still not only these 2 to 4 chains of amino acids, these ultra short peptides that bioregulators are. It contains a bunch of other stuff. So this is really an argument of, some people say that the whole herb is better. Some people just want to extract it for one specific thing in the herb, right? Standardized. So this is standardized versus concentrated. Different people have different views on which is more effective in the world of herbs, and ditto in the world of supplements, and ditto in the world of bioregulator peptides. So the cytogens are synthetically derived, meaning they're purely made in the laboratory. They're all from chemicals. They're not like extracted from something natural in the first place. So for that reason, they're actually cheaper these days, and so generally they're more popular. The only people who go for the Cytomaxes generally tend to be people who, again, prefer natural, for who cost is not a concern. And generally the Cytomaxes, although not always, are considered like more orally bioavailable, but that's kind of debatable as well, and we'll get into that. But generally, the Cytogens, people are more comfortable injecting them because they are only a few amino acids, and that's it. Whereas with a Cytomax, you're kind of injecting an extract from actually I think it's not cow, I think it's a pig's pineal gland, which, some people don't want to do, understandably. So the other reasons why they're more popular these days, I think a lot of the time, cytogens, is because they are easier to get, and there's more consistency with the purity, more predictable with the dosing, because obviously if you've got a natural compound, you don't know the exact amount that's going to be in there. Now there's another category as well, which is cytamins, and they are basically a combination of Cytomaxes with often other compounds added as well. There's vitamins, minerals, amino acids, or whatever. So one thing that's probably worth noting at this point, in case it's not clear, is that it's not only pigs and cows who have peptides in all these organs and glands. We have it too. And so there is this theory of aging from this school of thought that the primary, or one of the primary reasons why we age at all, is because we become depleted in these peptides. Our body is less and less able to synthesize its own. It's born of a certain amount, but it's not able to keep replenished to an optimal level. It gets more and more depleted. And as it gets depleted, our DNA and RNA is functioning less well. It's replicating cells less well. They have more faults. And so aging takes place. So this is a theory of aging. And obviously, if you believe that theory of aging, then suddenly these bioregular peptides become super important. And while I'm not saying that I believe totally that theory of aging, there is definitely evidence that it is a significant factor, which we'll get into. So let me quickly give the science for those who are interested. If this gets a bit too technical, don't worry, I'll be brief. So the idea is once these peptides enter the cell nucleus, we talked about that earlier and how that's fairly unusual, what happens is they interact with histones, which are the proteins which DNA is coiled around, the famous coiling thing, the caduceus looking thing. So that happens around the histone. And they interact with specific DNA sequences. So what Khavinson's team discovered is that they bind to the major groove of DNA through complementary electrostatic interactions. It's like an energetic interface. Each peptide sequence also appears to match a specific promoter region, essentially acting as a transcription activator. To simplify that, they're making your DNA do new, cool, interesting stuff, which helps to keep you healthy. I guess that would be a good way of putting it. The hypothesis of how they work is that each dipeptide or tripeptide sequence, I believe even quadpeptides as well, though I don't have it written here, is complementary to a specific DNA promoter region, facilitating binding of transcription factors and RNA polymerase, and upregulating gene expression for proteins associated with cellular repair, differentiation, and maintenance. So the whole maybe aging is caused by the DNA slowly being less able to successfully, accurately and flawlessly replicate cells, it helps with all that. So this might explain why the same peptide produces different effects in different tissue types. The accessible chromatin architecture differs by tissue. So the same peptide may activate different genes depending on where it lands. One way we can look at this, the peptides, is that they are kind of like a key that can potentially open or turn different locks in different places to have different effects. And this is important to bear in mind with bioregulators. For the sake of explaining them and also selling them, it's often, this is the pineal peptide, or this is the thymus peptide, or whatever. But when you really look into it, it's interesting that a lot of the bioregulators do dozens or hundreds or more different things. They have very interesting and wide-ranging beneficial effects. Now, for Epitalon specifically, which is the most pineal peptide, the primary documented mechanism is activation of Telomerase. So that is the enzyme that builds telomeres. So this leads us to another theory of aging. One of the theories of aging, which is, got a little bit out of fashion these days, but it is that your telomeres are one of the best ways to measure how much you have aged. And so what telomeres are, these little caps at the end of the DNA. And as these become shorter, there seems to be a significant correlation between the length of these telomeres and the lifespan of the organism. Now, I say seems to be, again, at one point this is thought to be a very direct correlation. That's less the case still these days. But overall, it is still a factor that is significant. So in normal adult somatic cells, telomerase is largely silenced, which is why telomeres shorten with each cell division. Back to that thing I said a minute ago, how potentially aging happens through a flawed replication, well, not only of these cells, but of the DNA itself and of the telomeres, which are the caps on the DNA within the cell. So what Epitalon seems to do is it appears to switch that telomerase back on, which generally is not on, certainly by the time you become an adult. Okay, so enough theory. Do they actually work to extend lifespan? Well, let's look at the actual research. Now, just before I get into this, I should explain the different peptides, the different terminology that you'll come across if you do your own research into this. So Epitalon is the Cytomin. It is the short, synthetically created pineal peptide that was discovered by looking at Epitalamin, which is sold these days under the brand name Pineamin, which is the Cytomax. So the Epitalon was discovered by looking at the constituents of Epitalamin. And Epitalamin was the extract from a pineal gland. I hope that makes sense. So if we look at this first study, early studies with Epitalamin showed lifespan extensions of 10 to 25% across multiple rodent strains. In fruit fly models, pineal bioregulator peptides also extended lifespan, and the animal data was consistent across multiple experiments. What about Epitalon, the synthetic version, the Cytomin? So animal studies found that Epitalon increased activities of antioxidant enzymes, including superoxide dismutase, often short to SOD, glutathione peroxidase, and glutathione S-transferase. This is obviously very important. Yet another theory of aging is that it is the result of excess free radicals and oxidation. Again, kind of dismissed these days as a primary mechanism of aging by most people, but it is still true if there is excessive levels of free radicals and oxidation that it does cause mature aging, and certainly in extreme cases and arguably in a lot of cases. So these endogenous, so the fact that it increases your body's own creation of these natural endogenous antioxidants is a significant thing. It also reduced the number of spontaneous tumors and metastases in mice, and is speculated to have oncostatic and anti-metastatic properties. Now, of course, when we're talking about things like longevity, one of the advantages of using animals rather than humans is that we can look at how long they actually live. So what happened there? So using the bioregulator peptides, specifically pineal and thymus, for 60 days a year, year over year, an interesting pattern emerged. As the study participants aged, the telomere lengths get consistently longer rather than shorter. Even staying the same length would be remarkable because the telomere length chart just, is a straight downward line for most organisms most of the time. But it not only did it not go downhill, they actually got longer. Now, what's even more interesting is that when they did this with human beings, exactly the same pattern emerged. And so one of the things that's interesting about that is it's not something you have to take every day. In these particular studies, we're talking about 60 days a year, year over year, increase the length of these telomeres year over year in human participants too. And that's not all. There are other human studies that are even more interesting. So another one, a human clinical study, Epitalon and Epitalamin both significantly increased telomere lengths in blood cells of patients aged 60 to 65 and 75 to 80, and their efficacy was broadly comparable. Why does that matter? It's impressive enough if it kind of stops you aging when you're, 30, but it's even more impressive if it reverses aging when you are so old that, it's terrible because I have some clients like this, but, if you're 77 years old and you go to a doctor and you complain about an issue, a lot of the time they just shrug their shoulders and go, you're getting old, unless it's acute. And because the idea is basically the older you are, the more far gone you are, and the more harder it is to heal you, to fix you. So the idea that it isn't just working on 30 or 40-year-olds, it's working on 60 and 70-year-olds is pretty amazing. Another study here, a human prospective cohort study on 266 people, all over the age of 60, demonstrated that treatment with Epitalamin, so again, this is the Cytomax, the gland-derived one, produced a 1.6 to 1.8 fold reduction in mortality during the following 6 years. A 2.5 fold reduction when combined with Pinealon, which is the Cytomax glandular extraction for the thymus gland, and a 4.1 fold reduction when combined with Pinealon and administered annually rather than once at the start of the study. So that's pretty incredible. Let me just say that again so you get it. So they took 266 people over the age of 60. If they just treated them once with Epitalamin, and by the way, I said Epitalamin or Pineamin, which is how the brand name it's sold under, is considered pharmaceutical. I believe this study is one of the primary reasons why. Literally. What pharmaceuticals can offer results like this? It's profound in how big an impact. So one course, which I believe is 60 days, led to a almost double 1.7 fold reduction in mortality in the following 6 years. So people who took it, people who didn't take it, almost twice as likely to die. Pretty amazing. Just adding Pinealon, which, as I say, is a significantly cheaper Cytomax glandular extracted peptide blend for the thymus, increased that to 2.5 times, so 2.5 times less likely to die. And then when they did both the Epitalon and the Pinealon annually for those 6 years, they were 4 times less likely to die. Pretty amazing. So very impressive, of course, if you're talking about longevity. Now, obviously, to some people, I'll believe it when the person's 150 or something. Well, we haven't got there yet, right? They're only developed in the 70s. But still, people, between 60 and 80, that's what we were talking about in the last couple of examples, that's at the age, especially in Russia, where these studies were done, where, that's where mortality is not unlikely. And so there we go. So in 2021, there was a human trial involving 75 women who were giving just 0.5 milligrams of Epitalon per day. This was found to increase melatonin synthesis by 160% compared to placebo. So going back to that point I made earlier about all these people recently on my social media talking about how much better they're sleeping according to all their wearables when they start taking Epitalon, it shows. It can work. It doesn't take very much. Now, melatonin affects more than just sleep. Sleep is something we can easily see that is improving with a wearable, but melatonin is also arguably the body's primary antioxidant. So again, helps to protect the cells from damage from excess levels of free radicals. So the fact that it's significantly increasing melatonin could have an impact there as well. I say could because the melatonin created by the pineal is not the same as the intracellular melatonin. But as I explained earlier, these bioregulator peptides rarely have an effect in only one place. So I think that would be a reasonable theory that it was also doing that, even if we don't have evidence for it. Another one, a human clinical trial on retinitis pigmentosa patients found that Epitalon produced a positive clinical effect in 90% of treated patients. Now, we talked about telomerase there. It is true that the C word cells, the bad tumors, they also use telomerase to become immortal, to increase their resilience to the body's immune system. And so there is some skepticism about, is this actually a good thing, increasing the telomerase? That's why I think it's important that we gave the research studies showing that it is not only increasing melatonin or telomerase or this or that, but we talked about the all-cause mortality as well, right? Because that is reasonably reassuring. But I'll talk a bit more about that telomerase later on. If I could go back in time right now and hand the 30-year-old me one tool that would help save me 15 years of pain, fatigue, confusion, then this is what I'd do. I would give myself advanced health genetics all access reports. Now, unfortunately, it didn't exist back then, but if I could, or if I could go back in time and give myself the results that I've generated now, that's exactly what I would do. It would have told me instantly that I have multiple genetic SNPs, making me prone to choline, calcium, and tyrosine deficiency, among other things, lead and aldehyde toxicity, and bad histamine metabolism, which explain my brain fog, the IBS, the chronic sinus infections, the fatigue, everything. Instead of trying 400 random things, I could have laser focused on the top 5 things that actually mattered for my DNA. And that's exactly what this can do for you now. Over 500 reports, 200 million variants or SNPs analyzed with 99.7% accuracy, 3 lifetime updates, and the strongest privacy in the world. We're fully GDPR compliant. We anonymize your data. We store genetics and personal info separately, and you can delete everything with one click. We don't sell your data, ever. Try it now. Go to advancedhealthgenetics.com. And if you have an old DNA file, because maybe you've used an ancestry service like Ancestry.com, 23andMe, anything like that, you can upload it and you have your first reports within hours. And if you don't, just select the DNA kit option. We'll send you a saliva test kit. It's really easy to do. Advanced Health Genetics is already by far the most affordable DNA reporting company of its kind. But if you use the code Rejuvenate at checkout, you get an additional 20% off your order. That's advancedhealthgenetics.com and use code Rejuvenate at checkout. Do it for the version of you that's tired of guessing. You deserve to know the truth about yourself. Okay, so if I know my listeners, a good portion of you are going to be like, wow, 4 times increased, reduced rate of dying. Sounds amazing, Elwin. Sign me up. And I'm that kind of person as well who's happy to give these things a go. So let's talk about practicalities. Let's talk about the different types, how effective they are, how much you need to take for it to actually work, because this is where things get pretty tricky. And I wish I'd had someone who could help me navigate it when I first learned about this all these few years ago. So it has to be said, and this is annoying, that even though the bioregulator peptides are orally reasonably bioavailable, as much as, a lot of different things, the injectable route is still the gold standard. And it's how most of the research was conducted. And I think that's important to say because, for instance, with that study the most impressive one I just mentioned there of the massive decreased risk of mortality, even in people who are reasonably elderly, that was with the injectable version. And I think the reason why it's important to say is because that isn't always made clear in the sales material of the people selling the bioregulators, who are usually only selling or primarily selling the non-injectable versions. So I'm not saying the non-injectable versions don't work. I'm going to give you guidance in a second about using them. But I am saying that if you want to get the results of the if you want to get the most impressive results of these studies, then that would be the most likely way to be able to replicate those results. I'm just being honest. So they are the highest bioavailability, obviously. If you're injecting anything, it's the highest bioavailability. It's also the highest risk. So that's a very good reason not to do it. Now, sourcing is always a challenge with these things. Probably the only way that you would be guaranteed to get the genuine, safe, injectable version, especially of, for instance, Epitalamin, is if you go to Russia or an allied country, you go to a doctor, you get a prescription, you go to a high street pharmacist, they fill the prescription and they hand it to you. That's the only guaranteed way. Anything else is risky. So that's the big challenge with it. So again, I know not good news, but I'm just being honest. Now, there are various people on the internet claiming to sell exactly the same thing. Can I vouch for any of them? No. If you were to, first of all, they're pretty expensive still, so you're not risking a small amount of money. And second of all, it could easily be fake. So that's definitely a risk you'd be taking in that case. Now, getting the actual Khavinson peptides, if you're ordering anything off the internet, it's always a risk, but the other versions are generally considered to be more reliable, more safe. And let's face it, if they accidentally, or if they sell you something that's not a placebo, right? If it's a sugar pill, if it's whatever, it's nowhere near as risky as injecting yourself with something. So the downside of all the other versions is significantly less. The upside is perhaps less as well, though. So I'm going to guide you through that. So what's the next best, most absorbed version? Probably the nasal sprays. And so there are some peptides where a nasal spray is actually preferable. And this is specifically usually where you want to get that peptide into the brain, because it helps to cross that blood-brain barrier. So Cmax and C-Lank, for instance, I did a video on those a while ago. Those are peptide sprays that a lot of the time nasally actually makes more sense. Oxytocin is an endogenous peptide and hormone that's often sold as a nasal spray so that it crosses, again, the blood-brain barrier. So there are different peptide products already sold in that way because it is pretty effective. And sure enough, Epitalon nasally, as long as it doesn't irritate your sinus tract, which unfortunately it does to me, is a very worth considering route of administration. The bioavailability overall is definitely lower than injectable. However, it's not that much lower. So the estimate is that nasal delivery requires 2 to 3 times the level of the injectable dose. There was one study that we talked about not long ago where a dose was actually mentioned, and it was 0.5 milligram of Epitalon per day for 20 days, which increased melatonin synthesis by 160% compared to placebo. So, for instance, if you want to try and replicate that study and that result, it would be reasonable to assume that using 1 milligram a day to 1.5 milligram a day via a nasal spray for 20 days could well have the same effect for you. Some people add other things like DMSO to the solution, the saline, which will improve mucosal absorption, because DMSO is a powerful solvent, but it is also potentially a powerful irritant of the nasal tract again. So I personally wouldn't risk that, but letting you know what some people do, that would definitely increase the absorption further if you are unirritatable, and you wanted to get the maximum value for money out of any peptides that you were spraying up your nose. Okay, the next most effective administration route is probably going to be sublingual. So this is where you place the peptide under your tongue and you absorb it through your oral mucosa. The key part of this is that it bypasses digestion. It's the least unpleasant of any methods that I'm recommending, I would say. The challenge is that it's got fairly limited evidence, but there is one study that found that 0.5 milligram of Epitalon sublingually for 20 days also did boost melatonin synthesis significantly, so it is at least that, showing that it has an effect. Then lastly, there is the oral capsules. These are the most commonly sold in the bioregulator category. I know, in the Western peptides, the injectables are most commonly, but you'll see if you start looking bioregulators, oral capsules are the most commonly sold because, of course, they're the most convenient, but they are the least effective. The digestive tract breaks them down because now the more stomach acid you have, the more that's going to be the case. I'll give that caveat. I haven't seen any of the research say this, but it's just obvious. If you have low stomach acid, and honestly, more people do than realize it, then that creates a whole host of health challenges, but it will also increase the level that you are absorbing these peptides orally. But overall, the percentage is still pretty low. So the general kind of consensus on this is if you wanted to give yourself the equivalent of, like a 10 milligram injection, you'd be talking about like 500 milligrams in an oral capsule. I can tell you, no one is selling 500 milligram capsules. When it comes to the Cytomaxes, the most that I see is 20 or 30 milligrams per capsule of a Cytomax. And then when it comes to the Cytomins, so let's be clear. So, there is another version. There's another Cytomax version that's also sold, which is called endolutin. So endolutin is again a pineal peptide, a Khavinson authentic pineal peptide. So if it's sold as the injectable version, it's branded as Pineamin. And if it's sold as the oral version, the capsule version, then it is sold as endolutin, confusingly. So anyway, endolutin, I've personally never seen more than 20 milligrams per capsule. So again, you'd have to have a lot to make a comparable level to that big dose. But then again, the big dose that was used, for instance, in that very impressive longevity study. But then again, as I said, there are studies with more modest results of people using just 0.5 milligram a day of Epitalon. So if we go back to that one, 0.5 milligram a day injectable, equivalent to 1 to 1.5 in nasal spray. So that would be equivalent to maybe something like 50 milligrams of oral capsules. So then, if you're having two 20 milligram capsules a day of endolutin, then you're kind of there. And is it possible to get to, is it affordable to get 60 capsules? So let's say 30-day dose. I mean, some of the studies are 20 days, some of them are 60 days. Let's say a 30-day dose, 2 capsules a day. Yeah, it is. It's not super, super expensive, and it's significantly less than getting that Pineamin, for instance, which I mentioned earlier. So even though it is way less absorbed, and even though it's pretty difficult to get the super high doses that were done using injections, which produced the most impressive study results, it's still possible to get a pretty decent amount. And I think that's why those people on social media who I'm seeing are getting pretty decent levels. Now, they're using these cytomins, but of course you need less of the cytomin. So those people I've seen are often doing something like 2, 3, 4, 5 milligrams a day of the Epitalon. And again, orally. And again, that would be kind of equivalent to 20, 30, 40, 50 milligrams a day of the Epitalamin. So it makes sense. It's, it works potentially. Now, there is good news of Pinealon, which we haven't talked about as much yet, but we'll get into, which is that, and Pinealon, not the same as Pineamin. Pinealon is like Epitalon, it's a cytomin. It's one of the other bioregulator peptides, the very short chain amino acids peptides that were discovered within Epitalamin. So Pinealon has a significant structural advantage when it's taken orally. Its molecular weight is so small that it can cross the blood-brain barrier via the PEP2 transporter. So in terms of oral bioavailability, I couldn't find the exact level, but it's just considered, from what I can see, to be significantly more absorbed. And I believe that's why often in the Russian world, all the kind of dosages are similar, but in the Western world, I've noticed that the people selling capsules will sell like 3 milligram capsules maybe of Epitalon, but only 1 milligram capsules of Pinealon. I don't think that's because they're being mean with the Pinealon. I think it's because the idea is that from their calculation, at least, it's like 3 times better absorbed. I want to get into exactly what Epitalon does and what Pinealon does, because we've really only done a few examples from studies there and dosing. But just before that, I want to talk about the importance of the pineal gland itself, because this is so different from mainstream and even most alternative Western science, this thing that was discovered in the Soviet era about the crucial importance of the pineal gland and the thymus gland, which again we may cover in more detail in another episode, and it's not usually talked about. Now, I'd say very recently in the health world, like last 5 to 10 years, there's way more of a focus on like circadian rhythms and how important they are to health. And this is a piece of why the pineal gland is so important. But up until that, there really wasn't enough focus on it. So let's talk about the pineal gland. So first of all, it's interesting because it sits right in the center of the brain, literally like the geometric center. It weighs roughly 150 milligram. It is not big. It's not even the size of a pea. It's about the size of a grain of rice. It's tiny. Now, a cow's one is a little bit bigger, or a pig's one as well. But you can see again where I said, if you are extracting from an animal pineal gland, you don't get very much pineal gland per animal. And so that is a challenge. And if you are, I don't know, in any way vegan oriented, I guess that would be another reason to use the synthetic type. Although I don't believe any cows or pigs still are being killed for their pineal glands. I believe it's still just, a side effect, but either way. So now the pineal gland has been considered to be very special and very important outside Western mainstream medicine for a very long time. René Descartes famously called it the seat of the soul. And throughout history, a lot of different systems have, for instance, the yogic system that talks about the different chakras, the pineal gland would generally be considered to correspond to the third eye chakra. So they believed that it would give you, spiritual insights, the ability to see hidden layers of reality, all of this kind of stuff. And so even though it's not considered to be very important in mainstream Western medical circles, it's certainly been considered to be very important throughout history to all kinds of spiritual, also medical traditions. Because we have to remember that places that considered it very important, whether it's ancient Egypt or ancient India, not only were they very involved and focused on spiritual practice, but they were also very, involved in medical practices of various kinds, which we may feel they're not as advanced as our current mainstream medicine, but they were way more advanced than most of the other civilizations around them. Okay, so that's the woo-woo stuff, but what does science say? So the science says that the pineal gland's primary job is to act like the body's biological clock. It receives information about the light-dark cycle from the environment via the eyes and a pathway through the hypothalamus, and it translates that into melatonin production. So melatonin is secreted only during the dark phase of the 24-hour period, the nighttime. The duration of melatonin secretion is how photoperiodic species, like humans, time their seasonal physiology, their hormonal cycles, and their circadian rhythm. So meaning, it's not just about your connection to the 24-hour clock, it's also your connection to the 365 days a year thing. And if you live in a place with seasons, that most of us do, it will, connect you to those seasons. And so these days you're hearing a lot about probably how dysregulation from that, how, for instance, you might have heard it from me, how a lot of issues with body composition, struggles where the usual advice doesn't work is because the body's kind of in a hibernation mode. Well, something like the pineal gland would be in charge of making sure that that doesn't happen by keeping you correctly in phase with the seasons and cycles of nature, if it is working optimally. So melatonin is very much related to that connection with light, or specifically a lack of light, but it's not just a sleep hormone. It is, as I mentioned, one of the body's most powerful antioxidants. It modulates immune function. It has documented anti-tumor activity. It regulates the expression of circadian clock genes throughout the body. And when it isn't working well, it coordinates a whole cascade of regulatory processes. When it isn't, that's when a lot of things start to go wrong. So as I said, maybe we'll do an episode on this, but there are good people out there doing good work on this these days, the importance of this alignment with circadian rhythms. And so, but their advice is usually, go outside in the morning and get sun. Don't get sun at night. Don't get light in your eyes at night. Maybe wear those red light blocking glasses, turn off bright lights, all of that kind of stuff. Get sun during the day, right? Don't be indoors all day. All that kind of stuff, which is all great, but it may be it may not be enough. It may not be effective for some people, and if it's not effective for you, it may be because even when you start restoring the correct signals to your body and your brain, and the pineal gland is part of your brain, it may not be getting those signals accurately. It may not be processing those signals accurately, and so again, why not? Well, that would be down to the relative effectiveness of the pineal gland. So I'm not saying that lifestyle and environmental changes aren't a good idea or aren't helpful. They almost certainly are. But I am saying that they may not be the whole story, depending on how degraded and disoriented and dysregulated the pineal gland has become as a result of those scrambled signals, how intense it's been, how long it's been, what else is going on, and what else is going on with the pineal gland, etc. So it is also the case that, with very rare exceptions aside, generally the pineal gland just doesn't function as well with age. This is why, older people, 60, 70, 80 plus, rarely sleep very well. They usually don't sleep for long enough, and their sleep is more likely to be disturbed. This is maybe not inevitable, but to some degree inevitable function of getting older. And I say that because even other mammals whose circadian rhythm has not been significantly disrupted by blue light and indoor living and all the rest of it, still show to some degree, although it's significantly less, degradation of the function of the pineal gland over time if they survive long enough to get old. So all this matters because some people theorize that the failure of pineal function is actually a primary cause of biological aging, not a side effect of it. So it's not I'm old, therefore I don't sleep very well. It's I don't sleep very well, therefore I'm old. That's potentially the right way round of actually looking at that phenomenon. Now, here's the other thing. When we talk about, things like the pineal gland being dysregulated, that sounds like a functional issue, not a structural issue. So basically it sounds like it's a matter of subjective opinion. But here's the interesting thing about the pineal gland. It is very noticeable if it is not optimal, because this thing happens to it called calcification. Now, there's yet another theory of aging that calcification is a good marker of aging. The more that our tissues specifically, because we want some things to be calcified, like our bones and our teeth, but the more that our tissues are calcified, generally that correlates with aging. Well, one of the things that calcifies at the highest rate of all organs, all tissues, and all glands in the human body is the pineal gland. So the hypothesis, supported by research published in Molecules in 2018 and elsewhere, is that the pineal gland functions as a bioorganic timing mechanism. And as it calcifies, melatonin production declines. The body loses one of its most fundamental regulatory system signals, and therefore the downstream effect ripples through sleep, immune function, hormone regulation, antioxidant defense, cellular repair, and cellular replication. So basically, almost everything that matters when it comes to feeling good, but also living for a long time. It's profound. It's massive. So low melatonin level is considered, correctly so, a biomarker of aging. When your own natural endogenous production is depressed, it is both a cause but also a sign of aging, as I mentioned a minute ago. So what about, let's mention a rat study here. When melatonin production was depressed by a pinealectomy in rats, so basically they just removed the pineal gland, accumulation of oxidatively damaged products accelerating the aging process. So basically, take a rat, remove the pineal gland, it's gonna rapidly age due to oxidative damage. Conversely, when they took young pineal glands and they grafted them into old animals, or exogenous melatonin was supplemented, both significantly increased the lifespan of the experimental animals. And yeah, there's a bit of a side issue here. I realized this was rats. So first point is that you could, and there are already rich people these days paying for blood of younger, maybe less wealthy people. I hope we don't see a trend where eventually people are paying for the pineal glands of younger people, but if they did, it would likely be effective. Good news is the same study shows that exogenous melatonin was also effective. So way cheaper, way more ethical, way less dangerous. But still, the fact that it works shows that the youthfulness or lack of calcification of the pineal gland has a profound impact on your rate of aging. That's a big deal, right? Another study showed that a pinealectomy, again in rats, stimulates C-words, initiation and growth in animals. So hopefully it's becoming clear, and maybe I should have done this section earlier, but I know most of you are more interested in peptides than pineal gland, so I wanted to talk about, give you what you wanted and talk about the peptides first. But now we're understanding the importance of the pineal gland, you might understand why I decided to dedicate a whole episode specifically to pineal peptides. So just before we get to the peptides themselves, one more thing. Let's just talk about, we talked about the pineal calcification, but let's just understand that a little bit more. So what is calcification? So it's basically a buildup of calcium phosphate deposits called corpora anoracea, which is, or like a sand, a brain sand, and it begins in childhood, it accumulates throughout life. So it's present in about 50% of people by age 18, and by middle age, which is probably my age, visible calcification is common in CT scans. So it's so extreme, so noticeable that the average person of the average age, I guess 40s, it will be visible in a CT scan. So what it does is it disrupts the pineal gland's ability to produce melatonin, because the metabolic machinery of pinealocytes, which are the pineal secretory cells, are compromised by the mineral deposits. So it's got these little sacs that are supposed to be secreting something, and they're full of this calcium phosphate sand stuff. So generally, unless there's been some significant health disruption, like I experienced and probably a lot of you have, the melatonin values are reasonably stable until about 30 to 40 years old. But just in the general population, even if they're otherwise fairly healthy, there tends to be a decline around that age. So, different times, different things decline. Growth hormone and DHEA tend to decline around 30. Testosterone tends to, make a dive, especially beyond 50, 60 in someone who's healthy, although there's a lot of variance in that. Obviously, there's menopause, different things tend to decline at different points. For melatonin, all other things being reasonably well, we're talking, 30 to 40 years old. That's when it's going to decline, even if you're otherwise reasonably normally healthy. And so, and it's associated with all the obvious stuff that we've talked about. But most obviously, you don't sleep as well and you don't sleep as long as you used to. In people over the age of 90, melatonin levels are less than 20% of their levels in their 20s. Literally a 80% reduction. Or to put it a different way, when you are 21, you are likely to have 5 times as much melatonin as when you are 91. So not such a big deal with all associated with sleep, but hopefully you realize by now that it's way more than just sleep, although sleep in itself is important, and it's way more important. So some of the factors that are most known to accelerate this process, which seems to be to some degree inevitable, one of them is chronic artificial light at night. So again, as we mentioned earlier, all the people talking about lifestyle and circadian rhythms are not wrong. I'm just saying there may be a little bit more we can do about it, but absolutely it is a accelerator of pineal calcification. EMF exposure as well. Some research suggests probably not just a little bit, but if you're exposed to a lot, because it tends to be exponential, like 5 feet away and 1 feet away. It's not like 5 times stronger, it's like 100 times stronger, something like it's kind of exponential. But if you have a lot of very close exposure, that would be my theory as to why some research points that it is a factor, some doesn't. It's just because of the intensity. But certainly if you have intense EMF exposure, I would expect it to. Chronic stress driving cortisol dysregulation. The cortisol dysregulation will then dysregulate the circadian rhythm as well, which will then have a knock-on effect on the pineal gland and melatonin production. It's kind of going the other way, but still has a negative effect in either case and accelerates pineal gland calcification. And then, of course, there is the tie with fluoride, which may be the most significant of all. So there is some genuine peer-reviewed research. There's Jennifer Luke's work published in 2001 showing that fluoride accumulates in the pineal gland at higher concentration than any other soft tissue in the body, even including the thyroid gland, where it also tends to accumulate and cause significant issues, and probably something that I've talked about more and thought about more, but this might actually be even more primary and even more important still. The researcher also noticed the correlation that people with heavily calcified pineal glands for their age had markedly higher fluoride concentrations in that tissue. So this is directly relevant to everything that we're talking about here. And I personally would advise avoiding fluoride for the effect that it has on the thyroid and the effect that it has on the pineal. The justification always used to be, of course, for teeth. And it's true that it does strengthen teeth, but these days we have hydroxyapatite toothpastes and different gels and formulas and all the rest of it, which do just as good a job of strengthening the enamel that protects teeth without potentially poisoning our brain, our pineal gland, our thyroid gland, and who knows what else. So I personally would recommend to avoid it. Some people talk about how boron helps to decalcify the pineal gland and removes fluoride from the pineal gland as well. I have not seen much evidence of this, but if you are aware of it, then leave it in the comments for me on YouTube, or if you don't like YouTube, send me an email and I'd be interested to see if there's anything that's based on, but I couldn't find it. Why am I always so dead set against generic health advice and one-size-fits-all protocols? Well, let me give you an example. 2 people came to me with the same problem, it seemed. They couldn't function, their energy was low. But when I dug a little bit deeper, one was anxious, they couldn't sleep, and they had headaches almost every day. Another one, very different. They had no motivation, they couldn't finish anything, and they found it really hard to focus. Now, I gave them completely opposite protocols, opposite supplements, opposite diets, opposite exercise. Both got dramatically better within a couple of months. The difference? It's not always as simple as this, but in this case, one gene. One gene that determines how fast your body clears stress chemicals, the catecholamines. If the anxious person had followed the protocol I gave to the other person, they'd have got worse, and vice versa. And that's what my upcoming book is about. Generic health advice is making you sick. It launches this Thursday, May the 7th, 2026. And the ebook is 90% off for the first few days after it launches if you register at rejuvenateblueprint.com. So now we've covered it in detail. Bioregulator peptides. We've covered in detail the pineal gland. So let's culminate by talking about the two main pineal peptides. So Epitalon is the first one. It's readily available. It comes in a synthetic tetrapeptide form, and it's derived from Epitalamin, which, as I mentioned earlier, depending on branding, you may also find as endolutin or Pineamin, depending on the form, the way that you would consume the product. So, but Epitalon is a derivative from it, which is synthetic. It is a tetrapeptide, meaning it is 4 amino acids in a row, and it is alanine, glutamine, asparagine, and glycine. So it is derived from the pineal gland. Its primary mechanism, as we discussed, is telomerase activation and pineal gland regulation, as well as pineal gland decalcification, and restoring melatonin secretion and circadian rhythm, which is all important for reversing or at least reducing the impact of aging, as we've talked about throughout this episode. So Epitalon works by stimulating peptidergic activity in the pineal. Essentially, what it does is it gives the gland the molecular signals it needs to resume more youthful function. Just a reminder, a lot of the Western peptides, what I call supplemental peptides, whether it's things like insulin and oxytocin, hormones, or whether it's things like BPC157 or TB500, these are all peptides that your body makes itself. And so as it makes less of those, you can supplement those to improve the quality of your life. Maybe it's essential to keep you living, like in the case of insulin. Maybe it's just something that is more of an optimizing thing, like BPC157. What the bioregulators do is go in there and help to fix your system, in this case specifically the pineal gland, so then it can start making its own youthful compounds. So it's the difference, a bit like the saying, give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day, teach a man to fish, and he'll eat for a lifetime, something like that. So the bioregulator peptides are not like giving yourself a fish, they are teaching you how to fish. That's the crucial distinction. And even more important when it comes to something like the pineal gland, because a lot of organs, like, say, the pancreas, if they are not working very well by the time you're 40, 50, 60, then the reason is probably because of suboptimal lifestyle factors to a large degree. But with the pineal, as we talked about earlier, if it's not working very well, to some degree it may be suboptimal lifestyle and environmental factors, but to some degree it is inevitable with aging, unless you were to give it the bioregulators to help to restore it to more useful function. So just to review, the primary benefits are restoration of melatonin, which includes improved circadian rhythm entrainment, better sleep architecture, restored antioxidant function, improved immune coordination, and normalization of the hormonal cascades that melatonin helps regulate. So yes, all the things that you might be more interested in, like testosterone or progesterone or cortisol, whatever, are all downstream of this melatonin regulation. Now, beyond the pineal's restoration itself, there is also its second major mechanism, which is telomerase activation. So Epitalon can activate telomerase and lengthen telomeres in all human cells, not only in the pineal gland, extending their replicative lifespan beyond the Hayflick limit while preserving youthful morphology and function. So basically helping to restore youthful levels of telomeres. So unlike most longevity interventions that work on a single mechanism, Epitalon has been studied across 5 major hallmarks of aging. So telomere maintenance, epigenetic regulation, oxidative stress resilience, immune recalibration, and circadian rhythm restoration. there is an argument that each of those five play a major, if not fundamental, role in aging. There is a whole school of thought that says circadian dysregulation is what causes premature aging. There is a whole school of thought, possibly the strongest argument I would say, is that dysfunctional immune system leads to premature aging. And a lot of diseases are either directly or indirectly related to, for instance, inflammation or the C word, which are all heavily down to immune system dysregulation, dysfunction. Oxidative stress resilience. This was, a few decades ago when I was first learning about health, considered like a major cause of aging. A little bit sidelined now as a theory, but it's still definitely a factor, and in some cases it's a big factor. Epigenetics, obviously huge. Telomeres, as we said, again, a little bit out of fashion to consider it like the number one sign of aging, but still big, so Epitalon, thinking of it as a pineal peptide is a good shorthand, but in reality, it is really more than probably any other peptide. It's good to think of it as an anti-aging peptide. Lastly, and also probably let's add a sixth to the list, this is one I haven't mentioned until now, of potential root causes of aging, so theories of aging that Epitalon also helps address, is the cell danger response, or senescent cells, otherwise known as zombie cells. So this is the idea that in a certain context, often when cells are overwhelmed with toxicity, viruses, various different issues, the body becomes overwhelmed and unable to deal with the toxin, unable to create new cells fast enough. And so what it does is it temporarily puts that cell into a form of kind of both stasis in terms of function, but also rigidity in terms of its defenses, because normally a cell membrane is kind of constantly letting things in and out, and that's an essential part of its function. But when it senses danger and poison and toxins all around, it goes into this kind of rigid state where things don't go in and out. So this is a perfectly healthy, natural response in the face of an acute challenge like an acute infection or acute poisoning. But when it happens on an ongoing basis and more cells are in this position and not functioning correctly, this is where potentially a lot of disease originates. In fact, again, this is another mainstream theory about what actually causes aging. And so Epitalon also appears to influence gene expression, promoting balanced cell proliferation and supporting the body's ability to clear away damaged or senescent cells. So when they become excessive, it doesn't necessarily just go in and kill them like some peptides do, but it helps to balance the level of clearing them and killing them versus encouraging new cells to be recreated in their place. So it's a kind of intelligent cell senescence reducer as well. So let's move on to Pinealon. Pinealon is a synthetic tripeptide, so meaning 3 amino acids. Epitalon, remember, had 4, with the sequence glutamine, aspartic acid, and arginine. So whereas Epitalon targets the pineal gland and works systematically, particularly as we talked about on telomeres and melatonin, Pinealon's primary targeting is the brain cortex and central nervous system. In Khavinson's system, it's considered to be the brain bioregulator. There are others, but this is the primary one. Its molecular weight is small enough to cross the blood-brain barrier very helpfully. So it's a brain peptide, and even compared to other bioregulator peptides, it gets into the brain more easily. Perfect. Most peptides don't do this. The fact that the Pinealon can get into the brain is what makes it interesting for neuroprotection. Now, once it is in the brain, Pinealon works by stimulating serotonin synthesis in the cerebral cortex cells. Serotonin is obviously the precursor to melatonin. So Pinealon can support pineal melatonin production from the precursor side, while Epitalon works to restore the gland's output mechanism. They're complementary in that way. Now, I know a lot of people among my listeners are concerned with excess serotonin. I would say rightly so. But generally, the serotonin excess is more to do with the gut serotonin. We really don't want to lack precursors for melatonin, which is what we were talking about here. And so I hope it's clear with everything that we've talked about so far about the pineal gland and melatonin, that providing that precursor for that melatonin in the brain is overall beneficial. I didn't find as many studies for Pinealon as for Epitalon, I'll be honest. I know anecdotally a lot of people are very keen on it and like it just as much. But to be honest, there aren't many studies that are as impressive as Epitalon, full stop, let alone in the bioregulator world. But there are definitely a few, so I'll read you a couple of them. Studies on aged rats demonstrated that a 10-day course of Pinealon administration improved performance on maze learning tasks compared to age-related controls. Histological examination of brain tissue from treated animals showed reduced lipofuscin accumulation, which is a marker of aging in the brain, and improved neuronal morphology in the hippocampus and cortex. So basically, a healthier brain. So Pinealon also appears to influence irisin, a peptide linked to cellular resilience, fat oxidation, and telomere maintenance, suggesting an indirect pathway to telomere protection similar to, though distinct from, Epitalon's direct telomerase activity. So again, Epitalon kind of seeming to be at the center of the strategy, the core, but Pinealon playing a very important secondary supportive role. Another study in 2014, an in vitro study found that Pinealon may stimulate the expression of serotonin in brain cortex cells. And yeah, this one's more interesting. In a clinical trial involving 72 patients with cerebral asthenia after cranial trauma, youngest 30, oldest 74, oral Pinealon, so that's beneficial, right? Because a lot of these studies that I mentioned, most of them are with the injectable form, at just 0.2 milligrams twice a day, which is not a lot at all, for 20 to 30 days, was added to conventional therapy. Patients who received Pinealon reported improvements in memory and emotional stability, decreases in headache duration and intensity, and some with motor or sensory aphasia showed regressed focal symptoms and improved speech. Now, this brings up an important point, actually, which I should mention here. The bioregulators are really not going to get you to a level, they're not going to take you from perfectly fine to superhuman. They really are there to help to repair suboptimal function, damage, stuff like that. Most of the studies are around actually fixing stuff, addressing different diseases, as that particular one was. That's partly what made the Epitalon, or actually, sorry, technically Epitalamin study that I mentioned earlier so interesting, because, of course, that was given to people who are actually perfectly healthy and generally just old. But a lot of the time, bioregulators are tricky. I've had people who take them who are like, this changed my life. And I also have met people who've taken them who noticed absolutely nothing. So the efficacy can vary widely. And I think one of the reasons is because the most they can do is help to fix and optimize, maybe targeting an organ and gland, but in reality, as you've seen, they work on a bunch of different things, but they can only fix what they can fix, and they can only optimize it in the sense of bringing it up to the natural capacity that you have as limited by your genetics and any other factors. But then, if your natural cognitive ability is completely average, and then it is impacted by lack of sleep, toxic exposure, traumatic brain injury, etc., and then you were to do a brain restoration peptide like Pinealon, often, and again, you have to do enough of the right amount, as we've talked about, but it can be pretty effective. It can be surprising. But if you're, of average intelligence, let's say, and you want to become a genius, it's not going to get you there. And it's the equivalent for, everything else, strength, the amount of strength in your muscles, like the amount of toxin processing capacity of your liver, whatever it might be. It can restore it back to what is optimal for you, but not beyond that. And I think that's why there's such a wide variance. It's a fixer. Whereas the supplemental peptides, or hormones, you can take enough oxytocin to feel much more loving and satisfied than the amount that you would produce naturally. You can take it so much insulin, you clear more blood sugar than you built in naturally. You can take so much testosterone that you become more anabolic than you would do naturally. Like, you can take these substances which do exist naturally in the body and take an amount that your body wouldn't be able to produce itself and have a supraphysiological response. That's not what bioregulators are for. Bioregulators are more for restoration. And that's why, unless you really have a problem with something, obviously, if you have, again, I'll mention the pancreas as I keep mentioning that. If you have a blood sugar issue, if you have insulin resistance, it's worth considering. But if you just want to optimize your blood sugar and it's already fine by any standard, then it's not going to do anything. So that's the distinction. So that's why the pineal and thymus peptides specifically are so interesting, and why I thought I would dedicate this episode to the pineal peptides, because beyond a certain age, no one's pineal is optimal. And as we talked about, really, even during the teenage years, a lot of the time the degradation has already started. So everyone can experience some benefit from these pineal peptides by the time they are a fully grown adult in terms of the brain development. When's that? Like 25, 28, something like that. By the time your brain is fully developed, you can already start to get benefit from these. Certainly by the time you are anywhere near what people might consider old, you can definitely get benefit from these bioregulator peptides, even if you're normal and healthy in every other way. That's what's interesting about them. Whereas with the rest, they really are more marketed as, used as, prescribed as a restorative process based on disease rather than just based on the aging process itself. Okay, so with that caveat in mind, let's talk about, I've got a list here, what results are possible for each peptide according to the research. But just, bear what I said in mind about bioregulators in general. So Epitalon, increased telomere length in blood lymphocytes, which has been demonstrated in a study of humans aged 60 to 80. Restoration of melatonin secretion rhythm, demonstrated in aged monkeys and elderly humans. Reduction in all-cause mortality in people over the age of 60, especially the study I mentioned of 266 people, showing a 1.6 to 1.8-fold reduction in mortality, all-cause mortality over 6 years. As you remember, that went up to as much as a 4-fold reduction if a person were to do a 60-day course every year over those 6 years. Lifespan extension animal models of 10 to 25%. Reduced spontaneous tumor incidence in multiple animal studies. Improved antioxidant enzyme activity, including the most important antioxidants, melatonin, of course, superoxide dismutase, glutathione peroxidase, and glutathione S-transferase. Improved sleep quality. This is the one that is most easy to tell, especially if you track your sleep with a wearable. And that's often reported very quickly, like the first few days, within weeks, hopefully, but often even quicker than that. Positive clinical effect in 90% of people with retinitis pigmentosa, according to one trial. Reduced chromosomal aberrations in aging cells, and possible improvements in skin quality via reduced MMP9 activity in aging fibroblasts. So pretty impressive, and that's just what I was able to pull together. I'm sure you can find more, but that's all the researched, studied benefits. From Pinealon, we've got neuroprotection, 20 to 40% reduction in cortical neuronal death under oxidative stress conditions. Just to give an example of that, I, as most of you know, if you've watched me regularly, have suffered from lead toxicity. So that's a great example of a genuinely worrying, excessive level of oxidative stress that absolutely can cause premature aging. And so something like Pinealon, if you have something like that, can definitely have some benefit. Improved cognitive performance in aged animal models, things like maze learning and memory tasks. Like I said, it's probably not going to help you go beyond your inborn capacity, but it can help you reach it. Reduced lipofuscin accumulation. which is a marker of cellular aging in the brain, improves sleep quality and circadian rhythm synchronization, human clinical evidence of memory improvement, emotional stability, and headache reduction in post-trauma patients. The emotional stability is interesting. I think that probably goes hand in hand with the circadian entrainment and hormonal optimization that comes from it. Possible indirect telomere protection via irisin pathway modulation, and brain-specific aging protection that Epitalon does not provide directly. So a really good combination of the two. Okay, so let's talk about the all-important dosing with Epitalamin, Epitalon, and Pinealon, because I'll be honest, I actually had to reshoot this because I looked at the original recording. I was like, this is still pretty confusing. And the reason is because there's a lot of, I think, misunderstanding and quite possibly misinformation, possibly for commercial purposes and possibly even involving the Khavinson people themselves about the exact dosages that are required. So I'm going to try and break this down step by step in logical order so you can follow along with me, because if you just look up what's like the recommended doses, they don't really necessarily make any sense. So let me explain it. Okay. So the most impressive study of all, of course, is this thing about between 1.9 and 4.1% reduced mortality in people between the ages of 60 and 80. So there are other studies, of course, that I've talked about, but that seems to be like the gold standard one. So the first thing to be really clear about for that study is that that study was using Epitalamin, not Epitalon. Epitalon is this, again, short synthetic peptide, which is part of Epitalamin. Second thing that's slightly confusing is that Epitalamin is not really available. If you are looking for the pharmaceutical grade injectable version that is identical to what was used in the studies, then it's actually called Pineamin or Pineamin. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Pineamin. And it's not really available outside of Russia without prescription unless you order it off some internet site, and then who knows what you're getting. So that's part of the challenge. And then there is another version of basically the same thing called endolutin, and that's the oral version, so that you swallow and digest, or there's a sublingual version as well. So, and then there is actually something called Epitalamin sold in some longevity clinics in the EU in IV form, but that is not actually either. It's just a combination of 4 amino acids and is not actually Epitalamin, even though it's sold as Epitalamin. Kind of crazy. So if we look at that original study, just to review that again, as I mentioned earlier, with just one treatment, that's where it is a 1.9 times reduced mortality. So one treatment, that was 5 to 10 milligrams of Epitalamin or Pineamin per injection over 10 days, 10 milligrams over 10 days, or 5 milligrams over 20 days. And then the optimal amount, if you really want to extend lifespan, is 2 to 3 times per year. However, I know most people watching or listening to this, they're not going to be able to get their hands on that. Maybe a decent amount of you have already got Epitalon, right? Or maybe you've got endolutin. So what is the equivalent dose to reach that? And that's the bit where it gets a little bit hazy, to say the least. So if you were to just look online, what you would see is the endolutin capsules are sold usually 20 milligrams per serving, which is 10 milligrams per capsule. And then they'll tell you to do it for a similar period of time, for like 20 days, 30 days, and then, 2 to 3 times per year. So that's kind of implying that the absorption orally is like half as much as what's absorbed through injection. I haven't been able to find any evidence for this. So I'm going to go ahead and say I don't think that's accurate. But those are the kind of claims being made that that's an equivalent dose. I would suspect that the amount of endolutin you need to reach that level would be significantly higher. How much? Well, let's talk about Epitalon for a second. So there is data on how much more powerful is an Epitalon injection than an Epitalon in a capsule. So I've got studies for this. So injectable, subcutaneous or intramuscular administration for Epitalon bypasses the gastrointestinal tract, delivering intact peptide directly to the plasma with reproducible bioavailability above 80%. Okay. For oral unmodified Epitalon, bioavailability may be less than 1% due to enzymatic degradation in the gut. So if we were to take that at face value, that would mean Epitalon is roughly 80 to 100 times more effective injected than it would be orally bioavailable. I'm not sure if that is quite true, because it is it's a tetrapeptide. I think the state of your digestive system absorption and would have a significant impact on that, but that's kind of a starting place, at least, right, for discussion of what the difference is. Now, okay, so what's the difference between Epitalamin and oral capsules? So there's no evidence for this, but the idea that the difference between injectable and capsules of Epitalon is like 100 times-ish, and the idea that the difference between endolutin and Pineamin is 2 times, it doesn't make sense, right? It stretches things a little bit. So anecdotal clinical evidence indicates that it's kind of the opposite. What do I mean by that? I don't find 20 milligrams of Epitalon, and yes, I've done the course several times, to really have a significant effect. I would personally say, from personal experience, that probably 2 milligrams a day of Epitalon capsule is more impactful than 20 milligrams a day of endolutin capsule. Does that make any sense? Well, let me tell you some more studies. The PMC peer-reviewed overview paper on Epitalon states directly that Epitalon is a better antioxidant than Epitalamin, and that Epitalamin was administered at 1,000-fold higher doses in the comparative study. That's a PubMed study. A separate primary research comparison used Epitalamin at 5 milligram per animal per day and Epitalon at 10 micrograms per animal per day for the same endpoint, which is a 500-fold difference for that specific effect. And lastly, a dosing analysis document notes that original studies used Epitalon at 10 milligrams, while Epitalon is dosed at 100 micrograms, which is a 100-fold difference in human protocol terms. So depending, with those particular resources, depending on what you're looking at, we're talking about Epitalon being anything from 100 to 1,000 times as powerful as Epitalamin. This is hotly contested. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the Russian peptide sites, they'll say, oh no, the Cytomaxes are actually more powerful and more effective than the Cytomins, but you have to really interrogate that and go, okay, but is that for equivalent dosage? And that's something that they're not really making clear. Again, this is where I'm saying I think there's a commercial interest here to, if you're only allowed to, it's kind of tricky to sell injectables. I don't do it. I can see why if you don't, you would have a vested interest in trying to make it out to be that, oh no, the oral ones are great, they work just as well, cheaper, easier, more convenient, all the rest of it. But is that actually true? So as I say, there isn't definitive evidence with the Cytomaxes that the oral type is 100 to 1,000 times less powerful than the injectable type, but it's not outside the realm of possibility that that's the case. Meaning that if, let's say at the lower end, a 5 milligram injectable dose is what's effective, you would probably want like a 500 milligram dose of endolutin at least to give an equivalent kind of level, which would be seriously, seriously expensive. So, because the challenge that I mentioned earlier, right, it's expensive to make a pineal gland extract. So if it is true that only 100th as much is absorbed if you have it orally, or let's be really optimistic, let's say it's 1/10 as much as absorbed, that still means you need 10 times as much of a very expensive kind of raw material compared to other equivalent raw materials. So that is a challenge. So because the epitalamin injection is so tricky to get, and because the oral version of epitalamin is so questionable as to whether it's really effective at the dosage that it would probably actually need to be an equivalent dose, then let's look at Epitalon, because it does seem to be one of the most important elements of epitalamin. So what does the research say about that? Well, I've given some of this earlier. So the intranasals may be 2 to 3 times less effective as the injectable. But what actually is the difference? Well, again, if I were just talking about before, 100 or 1,000 times as much. So if we look at the total dose for a second of epitalamin, we're talking about 100 milligrams, 2 to 3 times a year is the optimal dose used in that specific study. So if we take, again, the conservative estimate that Epitalon is 100 times as strong at equivalent dosage, then that would mean that you only need 1 milligram. And yet people are routinely using way more. If you look it up, then you'll see Epitalon, people are often using 1 to even more milligrams injectable a day for 20-day periods. Is that wrong? I don't know if it's wrong necessarily, but I guess what I'm pointing at here is that it may be unnecessary and there is no research into it. Who knows? It may well be counterproductive based on the research that's actually done. So maybe 0.1 milligrams over the course of 20 days, 2 to 3 times a year, would be closer to an equivalent dose. And if you really wanted to push it, if you don't really believe that, because even though the Epitalon is stronger than Epitalamin has a bunch of other stuff in it which may also be really impactful and effective that Epitalon does not. So, but still, if you kind of factor it all out, having, say, 1 milligram a day of Epitalon instead of 10 milligrams a day of Epitalamin still seems to be very, excessive, right? You really shouldn't need more than that. And in terms of I guess one piece of evidence for that is the intranasal doses that we talked about earlier. So where people are using even 0.5 milligram, and they found that to be pretty effective, even though intranasal is 2 to 3 times less effective. So really a lot of evidence that 1 milligram or anything a lot less, even like down to 0.1 milligram, may be plenty of Epitalon if you're injecting it. Now, if you're not injecting it, if you're using it orally, then we're going to probably talk about needing larger amounts again. So let's go back to that principle. If it's 100 times less absorbable through the digestive system than injectable, but then if 0.1 milligram is probably actually plenty, if you were injecting it, then that brings us all the way back to, what would that be? 1 milligram, like 10 milligrams a day of the oral type would be an equivalent dose. And this is where we're seeing a lot of people, social media, talking about having good results with 2 to 3 milligrams a day orally. It does actually maybe make sense, right? It's not necessarily a placebo because the Epitalon is so much stronger than Epitalamin. And so having 1 to 3 milligrams a day of Epitalon in a capsule may actually be way stronger and way more effective than 20 milligrams a day in the form of endolutin, which is, again, Epitalamin, which is the Cytomax, which is the animal-based one. God, I hope I'm not making this too complicated. So yeah, I guess kind of bottom line, if you really want to replicate the longevity study, then you've got to source yourself some Pineamin. You've got to do 100 milligrams over the course of 10 to 20 days, at least once, ideally a couple of times a year, every year. That's the optimal. Not available to most of us, so what are alternatives? We could look at something like 0.1 milligrams of Epitalon a day or more, and we could, if we want to take it further, but the evidence for that is a little bit sparse with all the maths that hopefully made sense this time. And then we could look at something from 1 to 5, but really if we're wanting to max it out, like 10 milligrams of Epitalon in a capsule for 20 days, which is 200 milligrams of Epitalon. It is expensive, but it's really not that expensive. And I hope you're seeing there's a lot of evidence that that may be a really powerful dose that is kind of equivalent to the most impressive study of all that we've talked about. Okay, and what about Pinealon? So with Pinealon, the oral dosing is more viable. So, potentially going for protocols of something like 20 milligrams per day orally for 20 to 30 days, there would be a lot of evidence that that would be good enough. The injectable form, you're talking potentially less again. So rather than 5 to 10 milligrams a day, we're talking about usually I've seen anything from 1 to 5 being recommended. I would say even 1 is not bad. And I personally have done cycles of 20 days of just 1 milligram a day and been happy with it. So even that would work on the injectable level. Now, there was a clinical trial showing that cognitive benefits in post-trauma patients who were using just 0.2 milligrams a day, as I mentioned earlier, for 20 to 30 days. So there's a lot of debate about this. I guess the point, and this is true for Pinealon and Epitalon, I guess the point is this. If you want to guarantee results, if you want to go with it enough that you're going to be able to test your melatonin before and after and see the difference, if you want to make sure that you see the difference on your Aura-ring results, if you want to make sure you see the difference when you do a telomere test, then going at the high end of everything that I've said would be the smart play. But there is some evidence in studies and a lot more evidence anecdotally that even significantly less can still make a difference. So, although I said, 1 to 5 milligrams injectable, there are certainly some people who've done less and still think it's effective. There are some people who've done, only 1 or 2 milligrams a day of the intranasal or even of the capsule form who still feel like they're getting benefits, especially with Pinealon, because it is such a small molecule that it's even easier for your body to absorb. So one thing that's worth noting briefly here, Epitalon was rarely used alone in Khavinson's longevity protocols. It was most commonly paired with him with Pinealon. Now, this is confusing a little bit again. There is Pinealon, which is the animal-derived glandular extract, which you can usually only get from these kind of Russian or Russian-affiliated places. And then there is Pinealon, which is a short synthetic peptide, which is sold more in Western peptide retailers. They're not the same thing. The Pinealon in Western peptide retailers is almost always actually what the Russians call Pinealon. It is a short synthetic peptide, whereas the actual genuine Pinealon is like the actual genuine Epitalamin, in that it is a animal glandular derived peptide complex with a bunch of other stuff in there as well, which is derived from the animal glandula. So just to clarify that for a second. But yeah, so Epitalon was often used with the synthetic thymus, sometimes with Velon, sometimes with Cristogen, sometimes with Pinealon. So those are the kind of main synthetic and main cytogens and cytomaxes. Usually cytomaxes combined with another cytomax and cytomin is combined with another cytomin, although not always. But often, anyway, the point is, if you're really looking for longevity and anti-aging, you usually would pair a pineal peptide, bioregulator peptide, with a thymus bioregulator peptide. I guess that's the central point. In the West, I see more often people stacking Epitalon and Pinealon, which is why I've done this episode on that. And that works as well. As I said, there are several mechanisms that they are complementary and supportive of each other. If you'd like to know more about peptide stacks and how to actually combine them, let me know. But I wanted to do this as a really thorough, hopefully the most thorough and helpful that exists introduction to these very important and underutilized peptides, which, as I said, in Russia are treated as very powerful prescription drugs. So who would these be most suited for? I guess the only kind of class of human that these would really not be suited for in most cases would be very young people. They're just not because they would do any harm, but just because they're a waste, right? This is really a thing that helps to combat, mitigate, reduce, and maybe even reverse decline of aging. So certainly anyone in their 40s or beyond, it would make sense. I know we have some young people listening, even if we have a few 20-year-olds maybe. It's kind of debatable if this is really necessary for you yet. There's probably a bunch of other stuff that you could be spending money on that would be better. But I believe the average age viewer is probably 40 plus. So yeah, if you're in that category where this could well be a good idea. So that's one obvious answer. If you are someone who actually has measured your telomeres and you know they're short, that would be an obvious one to say, okay, this is something I can do to actually address that. And personally, compared to, like, for instance, I'm a fan of astragalus, the herb, and astragalus extracts, like, is it TA65? But I personally would, money, dollar per dollar, would much rather invest in something like this than anything else for that specific situation. Anyone interested in proactively improving the longevity, of course. People with a history of brain injury or cognitive decline, especially if it's caused by this circadian disruption or oxidative stress, like I gave the example of me with lead toxicity. That's a great example, but anything that causes oxidative stress in the body would be a good candidate for this. If you are older and you specifically have poor sleep quality, or you have disrupted sleep rhythms, if you wake up a lot throughout the night, all that kind of thing, then it obviously makes sense in that case. Women with perimenopause and menopause. In fact, I mentioned a few times now that Epitalamin is sold under the brand name Pineamin as a prescription drug in Russia. Well, it is specifically, they have their own system that's similar to the West. Like, in order for a drug to be approved, it has to be approved for a specific condition, right? And so that's similar over there. And so Pineamin is actually specifically approved for menopause-related symptoms. That's what they sell it for. Doesn't only help with that, as I hope I've made clear by now, but if you have that, then you are literally the textbook case of the kind of person who is most likely to benefit from it. Shift workers would be another one, and a bit of an exception to what I said earlier. Even if you are only 25 or whatever, if you are a shift worker, if you're constantly having to be awake at night or awake at different times of the day because of shift work, that would potentially make you a candidate for these. Now, who would this not be a good idea for? People with active or suspected cancer. So this is a tricky one because obviously there are some mechanisms that have been shown to help that situation. But the thing is, telomerase activation is the same mechanism that those cells used to exploit and to become immortal. So animal research with Epitalon actually did show reduced tumor incidence, probably because healthier cells with maintained telomeres are less likely to get malignant transformation, and restored melatonin-driven immune optimization eliminates early cancers. But until there is a better human safety data, once you already have it, there is a risk. And I'm not saying it's proven, but the problem is it's also not disproven. And there is that risk. It's actually going to assist those cells. So that would be one category. And if you want to do it anyway, it's up to you, of course, but I'm pointing it out as a thing that I would definitely be cautious about. Pregnant or breastfeeding women, just because there is no safety data around it. Honestly, I doubt it's an issue personally, but there's always a risk. Children and adolescents, as I said earlier, it's just not relevant. There's no evidence of it causing any harm, but it's a waste of money and a waste of some poor animal's pineal gland if you're using the glandular version. With a few exceptions, of course, children and adolescents who are really sick in the kind of ways we've already discussed, with circadian disruption and brain injury and stuff, perhaps. People on MAOIs, SSRIs, or other serotonergic medications. Yes, that even includes methylene blue. Pinealon does increase the level of serotonin in brain tissue. So then combining that with a drug that stops the body breaking it down. This is, again, theoretical as far as I'm aware, but and of course it's especially true if you have the higher amounts. If you have the tiny amounts that are often in some forms of both of these, like I see, unfortunately it's often the Russian sites that are selling like the oral version of these bioregulators, and they're very, very low doses, honestly. and they're unlikely to make a difference. But if you're going to follow like the high doses that I talked about earlier as the ones most shown to be effective in the research, then that would definitely be an area of caution. If you have autoimmune conditions, there's always a chance, of course, that your body will have an immune response. And then, of course, anyone sourcing research-grade peptides online without medical supervision. Am I saying that only to cover myself? No. I genuinely, truly run these questions past a medical doctor. Now, can I run it by my normal practitioner? No. And I'm not saying that you will be able to either, but I am saying it is worth finding someone who understands this stuff, because there may well be a reason why it isn't a good idea for you. And so speaking to an MD who is open and understands this kind of stuff, and yet also understands you and your medical history, is absolutely not only a good idea, but what I would consider to be, and genuinely for my own well-being and what I do for myself, an essential step. Now, I realize this is, tricky or not, depending on the country you're in, but remember, these days we live in a big global world, and it is possible to maybe not have someone practice medicine, but it's possible to at least consult with a medical doctor who understands this. So, for instance, in the US, there are quite a few medical doctors who understand this stuff. We'll see, it's kind of a breaking news situation, but the last thing I saw on this regard is that a bunch of these peptides are being reviewed with a view of making them available again by compounding pharmacies, which then means that medical doctors would be able to not only consult on them, but even, prescribe them. So we'll see what happens with that. So if you're inside the US, you're kind of in luck with this. If you're in Russia, you're definitely in luck with these type of peptides specifically. And if you're in another location, just remember that you can still call doctors in these countries, and you can still have consultations with them. So don't feel limited to only who's in your local vicinity, and then you will be able to get that assistance should you wish to investigate and try some of these interventions. So thank you so much. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. Please support our sponsors. Please, if you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who you think might appreciate it. And if you have any questions or comments, leave them underneath the video on YouTube, and I read and answer all questions and many comments as well. Thank you so much. If you think I've missed anything, again, put it in the comments. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for topics for me to cover next, then again, let me know in the comments. I don't think there's any topic or recommendation that I've received at least more than, a month or two ago that I haven't then actually done at some point. So I actually read them, I actually listen. So if you'd like to know, let me know. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that video. You may have noticed I recommended a few different videos in that episode. And one of the ones I recommend is just here, if you want to click there. Or another one I recommend is just below, if you want to click on that one and watch that next.